So you likely just heard a robot telling you that as well. So I want to welcome you and thank you for attending the first webinar in our third season of our Earth Matters series. We really can't tell you how much we enjoy hosting these events. I want to thank you for attending over the years, or if this is your first time, let me be the first to welcome you. My name is Brian Sternidi, and I'm the Outreach and Engagement Manager with the Dutchess Land Conservancy. This year's speakers will be focused on an array of topics surrounding the Hudson Valley's rich biodiversity and history. Tonight, we are extremely excited to welcome our friend, geologist and science communicator, Becky Nesel, or as most of you might know her, GeoBeck. Becky will be discussing the Hudson Valley's geologic story across time, but first, let's go over some less exciting logistics about tonight's webinar, followed by a brief introduction to the Dutchess Land Conservancy and to tonight's presenter. So first, you are muted to ensure that there's no interruption during the presentation. Second, the raise hand function is disabled. If you have questions, please enter them to the Q&A box located at the bottom center of your screen at any time during the presentation. The questions will be addressed when the presentation is done or by our team during the presentation if possible. If there are a great deal of questions, we will likely try to combine them based on topics. Third, chat is disabled for this event. Fourth, closed captioning is enabled for this event. To turn this function on, please select the CC icon at the bottom right of your screen. And finally, I'd love to hand it over to Julie Hart, our Director of Education, who will tell you a bit about the DLC, this webinar series, and our guest presenter tonight. Julie.
Thank you, Brian. Good evening, everyone, and thanks for joining us. I'm Julie Hart. I'm an ecologist and educator here at the Dutchess Land Conservancy. I think many of you are probably familiar with the DLC, but for anyone who's not, let me just give you a quick overview. The Dutchess Land Conservancy is a private nonprofit land conservation organization located in the Hudson Valley of New York State, and we're dedicated to preserving the farms and forests, wetlands and waterways, open spaces, and wildlife habitats of Dutchess County. We are an accredited land trust, and since our founding in 1985, we have worked with hundreds of landowners and protected over 46,000 acres of land. And many thanks to the Molly B. Schaefer Education Fund for sponsoring this event. So we're so excited to start off our new season of Earth Matters. As Brian said, this is our third season. So we're very excited to bring a whole new slate of speakers to you. On the first Wednesday of each month through April, we've got a new fascinating speaker with lots to teach us. And this season, we're learning about the history and ecology of our own Hudson Valley. And I hope that these webinars will help you to see the lands around you in a new way, to read the stories that can be found in the rocks, the waters, and the trees, and to find a new appreciation for this incredible landscape that we call home. So let's get started. Tonight, we are thrilled to welcome Becky Nesel, who's also known as GeoBeck, as our kickoff speaker for the season. Becky will lay the foundation for the entire series by talking about the geologic history of the Hudson Valley. So Becky is a geologist and a science communicator who shares geoscience in a really fun and accessible way, bringing with her all the excitement and wonder of learning something new. She specifically looks for ways to connect geology to the everyday world. For example, telling geological stories of building stones. I bet you've never thought about where bricks come from, for example. And exploring the connection between a location's biodiversity and the bedrock beneath it. Her educational videos and photos are shared on social media, where she is known as GeoBeck. And she also leads geology walks and hosts and produces a local TV show about geology. She loves to travel and share the geologic history of different places around the country and the world. And Becky's also just a really great role model for young scientists. There's a lot of interesting opportunities for young scientists these days that really weren't available even just a decade or so ago. And she's really at the cutting edge of that. So with that introduction, I'm going to turn it over to Becky, who will take us from ocean floors to glacial shores and tell us about the Hudson Valley's geologic story.
Thank you, Julie. That was so sweet. And thank you, Brian. I'm really excited to be talking to you guys today. I always love working with the DLC, and I love being part of their volunteer program as well, where I've given walks, geology walks, and give walks sometimes still. So in the future, make sure to check those out. But yeah, I'm really excited today to tell you about the Hudson Valley because I grew up here and I live here currently. So not only is the Hudson Valley's geologic history really fascinating to anyone, any geologist, any person interested in rocks, but it's also just personally fascinating to me because I grew up here, and this is where I kind of blossomed my curiosity about the natural world. So, a little bit about me. Julie already did a pretty good job explaining what I do. Like I said, I grew up in the Hudson Valley. I went to college and I discovered that geology was a thing, something I could study. And I went to college at SUNY Oswego, which is right on Lake Ontario in New York. So I grew up in New York, I went to college in New York, and then I came back to the Hudson Valley, and that's where I currently live. I worked in the construction and engineering industry for a short time after graduation and realized it wasn't quite for me. And that's when I started making educational science videos online, and now it's my full-time job, which is a dream. A little bit about what I do. Julie already told you a bit, but I lead geology walks. This is a photo from one of the DLC walks. A main portion of my work is educational videos. So social media is where I do most of my work. So I do YouTube videos, Instagram and TikTok. And I work with tourism boards or destination marketing organizations to show a new perspective of their region or their state by talking about the rocks and showing people a new perspective of that place, whether they live there or they're visiting. I also have a TV show with a local production company called Hudson that I highly recommend you check out, not only just for my show, but just for all the amazing content on there. And it's actually now free, which is a new update on that. So that's really exciting. So yeah, let's see what we'll learn today. So first, I'm going to go into a little intro of geology so that you're not completely lost about what I'm talking about. I know that many of you likely haven't learned about rocks or geology since maybe middle school, or maybe you've picked up a book about it, or you don't know anything. Either way, I want to make sure that what I'm talking about is digestible for you to understand. So that's why we're going to do that first. Then the main portion of today's talk is going to be talking about the Hudson Valley's geologic past. So the ancient foundations to how the landscape got to the shape and beautiful landscape that it is today. And then lastly, we're going to talk a little bit about how the Hudson Valley structures hold the story of its geologic past. And so first we're going to go to geologic time. This personally, I think, is like the most important thing to talk about before talking about anything geology related, because as humans, we're not used to thinking in such vast timescales, and the Earth is extremely old. It's 4.6 billion years old. And geologists use this timescale to keep track of what's been going on and what's happened in the past. And it also changes, like when new things are discovered in our rock record, sometimes we add things to it or kind of like move something a little bit. And that's really cool to me because geology is always changing. We're always discovering stuff. So I also like showing people the different ways that geologic time can be shown, because personally, I'm a really visual learner and geology itself is a really visual topic field. So I actually really like this spiral way that time is shown, because it kind of has this view of like a pie chart where you can see like what portion of our planet's past was this certain time period. So you see the different time periods like the Hadean, Archean, Proterozoic, Paleozoic, Mesozoic, and Cenozoic. And within those, there's also like smaller categories of certain time chunks in the past. And then this one on the right, I really like because you can compare it to different life forms and when certain life forms started to show up on our planet. Although this one isn't accurate in terms of like the ratio of time, because you see at the bottom, there's the Hadean, the Archean, and Proterozoic. Those as you see on the spiral, they are a huge part of our planet's history, but from the Cambrian to present day is where a lot of our history is in terms of life. So that's why this one looks like that. So rocks and minerals. Rocks are made up of minerals, so minerals are the building blocks of rocks. So minerals have these specific requirements for them to be able to be labeled as a mineral. So they have to be naturally occurring, inorganic solids with a definite chemical composition and an ordered internal structure. And some common minerals are quartz, feldspar, amphibole, and calcite. And all of those are found in the Hudson Valley in abundance. And on the picture right here is a piece of garnet that I found when I was on a trip to Nevada recently, and I love it. So the types of rocks and the rock cycle, there are 3 main categories of rocks, which if I was giving a walk in person right now, I'd probably ask you guys to raise your hand and tell me if you can name the different types. But since I am talking to a screen right now, I'm going to tell you myself. So we have sedimentary rocks, which are formed from the deposition, cementation, and compaction of sediments. So on the left here, we have a photo from Watkins Glen in the Finger Lakes of New York. I just visited for the first time and it was incredible. I took all these photos in my travels over the past few years, and this is Watkins Glen has shale and sandstone. And then the top middle is from Wyoming. That's sandstone with some beautiful crossbedding. And on the top right is some shale from Nevada with some trilobite fossils in it. And on the bottom is sandstone, red sandstone from Nevada. So as you can see, sedimentary rocks are all part of the same category of rock, but they are incredibly diverse and can show up in many different ways and tell us so many different things. Next, we have igneous rocks, and igneous rocks are formed by the cooling, the crystallization of either magma underground, which are intrusive igneous rocks, or extrusive igneous rocks, which are formed by the cooling of lava or the explosion of a volcano where a bunch of ash flies everywhere and rocks and then gets compacted. Once again, very diverse, lots of ways for these to form. We have some lava rock from Oregon on the top left. That is from a lava flow from about 7,000 years ago. The top right is granite, 700 million year old granite from Connecticut. And that's actually the exact granite that was used in the pedestal of the Statue of Liberty. So I love that one. And that's also the bottom left, that piece of granite. I didn't realize when I was making this, but the bottom 3 are all pictures of my hand holding a rock. The bottom middle photo is rhyolite from Nevada, which forms from explosive volcanic eruptions. And then we have obsidian on the bottom right, which is a glassy lava rock. Lastly, there's metamorphic rocks, which personally are my favorite just because a lot of the time metamorphic rocks are extremely old and have been through so many things in our planet's past. We have some schist on the top left from Bash Bish, which is in Tectonic State Park. There's the Gore Garnets on the top right. There's some marble on the bottom left. The one of me walking is gneiss from South Carolina, and then we have some more schist from Bash Bish and some gneiss from Maine on the bottom right. So the rock cycle, these 3 types of rocks, the 3 categories of rocks, if you take like one rock and hold it in your hand, that one rock could have gone through one of these phases. It could have gone through 2 or all 3, or maybe it'll only in its whole existence go through 2 of these phases of being a rock. So there are a lot of different ways that this can happen. Most rocks in the early Earth started out as magma crystallizing one way or another. And then when an igneous rock is cooled and at the surface, it will be weathered and eroded away eventually into sediment. So then that sediment gets deposited somewhere, like in an ocean, maybe into layers, and then it gets buried, compacted, and cemented, and it becomes a sedimentary rock. And then later it can get buried, or maybe some kind of continental collision happens and it gets put under tons of pressure and heat and turns into a metamorphic rock. And then maybe it melts completely again and turns into a whole other igneous rock. So that's just one example of the process that can happen with just one rock. over its lifespan on Earth, even though they're not alive. So next, I want to tell you about the theory of plate tectonics. Earth's lithosphere is broken up into different pieces. So you probably already know like a pretty general idea of this. And essentially, these pieces move around our planet's surface, and they form volcanoes, mountains, rift valleys, earthquakes. It's pretty much the reason that anything cool exists on our planet. So here's a nice little diagram of the different boundaries. So we have convergent boundaries where two plates are coming together. A lot of that forms mountains. So the Himalayan mountains, for example, are currently being the two plates are currently converging and forming mountains. We have divergent boundaries where two plates are moving apart, and we have transform boundaries. And although there's technically really 3 types of boundaries, they can also be very complicated and show up in different ways. Sometimes 3 plates can be meeting in one spot, or maybe a transform fault can be like more diagonally, like they might be going in kind of weird angles to each other. But that's just another cool thing about Earth and how diverse it is. Next, this is a map of the major tectonic plates on our planet, and it just gives you an idea of what it looks like and kind of the directions that they're going in. Now we're going into New York. We see this map right here, and it's a topographic map of our beautiful state. Today, I'm going to be focusing on the Hudson Valley, but when you're talking about Hudson Valley geology, you really can't talk about it without learning about the history of essentially the entire Northeast and New York State as a whole. So what you learn today, you'll likely be able to kind of carry most of that into your knowledge about the Northeast. Maybe if you take a trip to like Connecticut or Maine or just other parts of New York, you're still going to be kind of familiar with things that you see, and you might recognize things I told you about today. So we have this physiographic map of the state, and the Hudson Valley kind of is represented by a few of these different things, these different regions. So we have the Hudson Highlands, a little bit of the Newark Lowlands, we have the Tectonic Mountains, we have the Hudson River. I mean, the Catskills aren't necessarily, I don't think, like part of the Hudson Valley, but I kind of do loop in some of that stuff into my idea of the Hudson Valley. And this is a geologic map of New York, and I know it's probably very overwhelming if you are not used to looking at geologic maps. That's totally fine. I'm not going to be going super into detail. I just wanted to show you how awesome our state is and how diverse it is in terms of rock formations and all these things that have happened. We can learn so much about our planet's history and the Northeast's history from our state alone. So I'm going to ask you to get your time machine outfits on, whatever a time machine outfit is, and we're going to go on a little journey into the past. So our first stop is very far away, but first I'm going to tell you about what we're about to embark on. So I love the analogy that the whole geologic history of the Northeast is essentially this huge car crash. I definitely didn't make that up, but I love when people refer to it as that, because it really is just this like huge Mod Podge of different land pieces over millions of years that have kind of stuck onto our continent. And it's so interesting because a lot of that can be seen, a lot of the evidence of that can be seen in New York. So our first destination, we're going way back 1.3 to 1.1 billion years ago to the Grenville orogeny. This is the first kind of tectonic event, this mountain building event that happened. And at this time, the continent that we're currently on, which is referred to as Laurentia, it's the ancestral North American continent, that was a lot closer to the equator. It was actually like right on the equator. So much different than the climate we have now. And life on Earth was also very different, not only because of the climate, but also obviously because of how long ago it was. It was mostly, there wasn't really like animals yet. There was, I believe there was multicellular life, but most of life existed in the oceans and there wasn't much happening on land. See, everything else on this little life timescale thing was way after this was happening. So what happened with the Grenville orogeny? Orogeny is a word that geologists use for when a collision happens. So like I said before with the convergent boundaries, what happened here was this belt of land collided with ancient North America, with Laurentia, and it formed these huge mountains called the Grenville Mountains, and those were also volcanoes. And at the same time, it subducted some oceanic crust under. So that's why volcanoes formed, is because the subduction of that crust melted that rock, and there was water going in there and stuff too that made lava, or magma, not lava underground. So we have this map, which I love because it shows how far the Grenville Mountains extended from Canada all the way down to Mexico. And obviously at the time, it wasn't Canada or Mexico or America or anything. And it was also still very far away from our current position on the globe. But this map is really cool because that pink right there represents the underlying rocks from what is left of those mountains. So the mountains eroded away a long time ago, but the remains of those mountains, the little stubs, we refer to that as basement rock, and all of New York essentially is underlain by this basement rock. It's just not really exposed across the whole state because it's covered by younger rocks that have been deposited, but it is exposed in the Adirondack Mountains, as you can see here, and also a few other places. So here's a map showing the exposed Grenville rocks. So these rocks, like I said, are over 1 billion years old. And it's just so cool that we have so many of them in our state, even though not the whole state has them exposed, but the Adirondacks are incredible, and the Hudson Valley, of course. So we have the Hudson Highlands, and we also have some other things. But here's a photo of the Hudson Highlands. This is an abandoned iron mine in Harriman State Park that I recently went to, and it's not only incredible like being in an old mine, but just knowing how old these rocks are and that they are exposed at the surface for me to look at is just incredible. Here's another view of the Hudson Highlands from the top of Storm King Mountain. So from this picture, I'm standing on Grenville rocks and looking at them. So this is a really cool picture because when you think about the whole history and how long ago this stuff happened and that we can still see evidence of it is just mind-blowing, honestly. And another fun thing is that in the mid-Hudson Valley, there's essentially like no exposed Grenville rocks other than Stissing Mountain. And I have given a walk at Stissing, well, at Thompson Pond, where we were at the bottom of Stissing Mountain. And I also love this because it's a vintage postcard of Stissing Mountain and Stissing Lake. And this essentially is like a block of that basement rock that got thrusted up towards the surface during one of the later tectonic events that I'm going to be talking about. And I think geologists aren't like, when I read about this, I don't think that it's completely known as to like the exact mechanisms of why this specific block got thrusted up and like got separated from the rest of the basement rock. So that's just really interesting to me. And it's also really cool because the Mid-Hudson Valley doesn't really have like many peaks like this. And if you've hiked Stissing, you know that this is a very steep mountain, and it's just cool that in our bodies as we're climbing that we can feel the steepness of the mountain and know that it's just so unique for the immediate surrounding area. So our next destination is, we're kind of taking a big jump to about 600 million years ago. when the supercontinent Rodinia broke up. And I didn't mention this, I don't think, but during the Grenville orogeny, it formed a supercontinent. So not Pangaea yet, but a different supercontinent called Rodinia. And this was formed from those, the mountains being formed with the Laurentia. And then millions and millions of years later, it eventually broke up because our Earth, like I said, plate tectonics, they move and they're always changing and moving, even though it happens very slow. And over millions of years, it broke up. Unfortunately, breakups are sad, but there's a lot of fun stuff that happened after that. So, and we wouldn't be here without that breakup. So it formed the Iapetus Ocean, which is the Proto-Atlantic, it's known as. And that was about, this photo's from about 565 million years ago as that breakup was occurring. So when this was happening, those Grenville Mountains were continuing to be eroded. So it takes a long time to erode such tall mountains, but over time, from rivers and wind and glaciations, those mountains were eroded into sediments, and they were eroded on both sides of those mountains. And on one side, there was the inland sea, that was, part of where our current continent is. And then on the other side was the Iapetus Ocean, and it was still really close to the equator. So it was a really warm, shallow sea. And in warm, shallow tropical seas, we get carbonate deposition, which, think about something like if you go to Florida or the Bahamas, you see this really beautiful like white sand. That is carbonate sand. So it's made of calcium essentially. And that is from shells, from bones, and just carbonate muds that have formed over time from the breakdown of all these living organisms. And I'm kind of skipping, like that seemed like a quick transition, but not much. There isn't too many like rocks in the Hudson Valley that I know of that are directly related to this part. And the next portion is kind of like the bulk of a lot of geology that I talk about in the Hudson Valley. So the next destination, hope you're not getting whiplash from our time travel, but another collision happened. So you're probably noticing a trend here. There's a collision, there's a breakup, there's a collision. Can you guess what's going to happen after this? So this one is the tectonic orogeny. And this one is my favorite personally, just because it's so applicable to so much of the Hudson Valley's history. So here's another handy little diagram. We have the tectonic mountains that formed from this orogeny, where I'll go back. There was this little island arc that was off the coast of Laurentia. Remember, Laurentia is ancient ancestral North America. So as you can see, there's like the little outlines of what the United States would look like if it were on this landmass. And so these islands were off the coast of Laurentia, and the Iapetus Sea was in between them. So over millions of years, the tectonic islands slowly made their way towards Laurentia and eventually collided with it. So when that happened, there was also volcanoes, the volcanic arc, and then there was also tons of sediment that was in between those islands and the main continent, because there was that ocean between it. And in that ocean, tons of sediments were being deposited over time, and it was a lot of mud. So when that mini continent, when those islands collided with the main continent, that mud had to go somewhere. Think of like if you're taking like a piece of foil and you have your hands on both sides and you're kind of like squishing it together, there's going to be somewhere that the foil in between your hands has to go. So it's going to get crumpled, or maybe some of it will go under other parts of it, or maybe get thrusted up above your hand. And so that's essentially what happened. A lot of squishing and squeezing and burying and thrusting. And it formed the tectonic mountains. And then at this time, there was also the inland sea that was still on the other side of that. So then there was also the carbonate shelf that was still there from, you know, that ocean. So here's a little way for us to understand it in our modern day terms. And if you look at this photo on the left, you see our modern day North America, and you'll see the continental shelf in gray. That is essentially where all of the carbonates were being deposited. And over here, you also can see like a little diagram of what our current continental shelf looks like. So here are some rocks in Kingston, and some of you may recognize this. It's at the new Sojourner Truth State Park across the river. Well, across the river from me. I don't know where you are, but here are some carbonate rocks from that continental shelf that over time got thrusted up after they were compacted into rock and, you know, made visible to where we can see it now. And here are some images that I took through my hand lens. You can see the little calcite crystals, and you can see how they're kind of like really rhombohedral shaped, and they kind of look like little squares, but, you know, they have like a little bit of a diamond shape. That is how calcite is shaped. So it's really cool seeing that in the rock. And then we also have a little fossil here through my hand lens. I'm not a paleontology pro, so I can't actually tell you exactly what that is. I think it might be some sort of coral. There are a lot of coral and sponges, I believe, in this rock. Another thing that happened was metamorphism. So I was talking about a lot of that squeezing and crumpling. That was happening to those sediments that I was talking about that were in that ocean between the island arc and the main continent before it collided. So when that sediment, all those sediments got pushed up against each other and buried, many of them got metamorphosed. Some of them they kind of got away a little bit, and we see that in the Austin Glen Formation all over the Mid-Hudson Valley. So if you go across the Kingston-Rhinecliff Bridge, you'll see those outcrops, especially in the winter. They're shown really well. They're usually kind of covered by plants in the summertime, but there's really cool folds and layers of the rocks that are shown there. So those are the ones that weren't metamorphosed, but they were folded. They were affected a little bit, but as you go further east, so I'm in Millerton, and around here is where you start seeing some metamorphism when you go to this kind of area. So Bash Bish, I mentioned before, is a great example of some of those metamorphosed muds from that ocean. I'm going to go back to those in a second, but here are some pictures of rocks around the Hudson Valley that were the bottom of that ocean that I was just showing you, the Iapetus Ocean. So here on the top left, we have Innisfree Gardens, and not only is Innisfree just such a beautiful place to go, it also has this incredible large outcrop of phyllite. And phyllite is, I'll go back here. It's kind of in the middle of that metamorphic continuum. So you have the muds, and then it gets compacted into a sedimentary rock called shale. And then when it undergoes enough metamorphism, like a slight amount of heat and pressure, it turns into slate. And then as it gets more pressurized and heated, it turns into phyllite and then later schist. So phyllite it's kind of shiny. It has foliation, which is when minerals, I have another thing of that. Foliation is when minerals that were originally kind of randomly scattered around the rock get squeezed enough so that they kind of align like dominoes, or think of like a pile of paper, all, you know, they're all parallel to each other. If you were to like throw the paper in the air, they wouldn't be foliated anymore, but in a stack, they're foliated. And many of the minerals in these types of rocks they start out as clays, and when clays are put under enough heat and pressure, they turn into mica minerals, which are what give these rocks their little shiny luster. I'm sorry, I'm kind of like skipping around a lot, but I want you to really see like these diagrams as I'm talking about the rocks. So the top middle is Dover Stone Church, which I've also given a geology walkout at the DLC, and it's one of my favorite places in the Hudson Valley because it just has so much to look at. There's not only the rocks themselves, which are schist, they are slightly higher on the metamorphic continuum compared to the phyllite, and they have some really cool garnets that are visible. So if you ever go to Dover Stone Church, make sure you take a look at the rocks, and there's going to be these little like lumpy, reddish, dark lumps on the rock. It's kind of sticking out from the rest of it, and those are garnets. And garnet is really cool because it's an index mineral, which tells us certain conditions that the rocks were experiencing when they were being metamorphosed. Then there's High Falls, which is in Philmont, and that is also some phyllite that got metamorphosed. Then we have Bash Bish, which, as you can probably tell from how many times I've mentioned it, is one of my favorite spots in the valley. This is also schist, just like Dover Stone Church. It's just slightly less metamorphosed because it does have garnets, but they're not as large as the garnets at Dover Stone Church. So that's how I know with my little rock detective lens that Bash Bish, the schist there, didn't go under quite as much pressure and heat as the schist at Dover Stone Church. On the bottom middle, we have some examples of the Austin Glen Formation that I was just talking about. These are the sedimentary rocks that have not been metamorphosed. So those thicker layers are the sandstone, and the thinner, more brittle layers you see are the shale. So this was all part of the deeper part of that ocean. This stuff wasn't the carbonate shelf like I was talking about from the rocks that I showed you that are in Kingston. These were like the deep, deep ocean, like really dark, no sunlight happening down there. And the sandstone layers that you see are really interesting because those tell us that some kind of like underwater avalanche happened, which is called a turbidite. And that happens when possibly like an earthquake happened or something at the surface and sent a bunch of sediment like from the beaches of that island arc and sent it down in an underwater avalanche to the deeper parts of the ocean and formed these layers that are made up of the coarser sand material compared to the more finer grained muds that were creating the shale. So once all those muds and sands got buried over a really long time and compacted, this is what they turned into. Here I showed you before, but you can see these are both taken at, I believe these were both taken at Bash Bish of the schist. And you can see with a little fern as a size marker that you can see those nice shiny minerals. And that, like I said, is the mica minerals. And then also on the right, you can see me pointing to the greenish part of the rock, which is chlorite, which is it's a common mineral that's found in schist. It's one of the first minerals that kind of transforms from the clays. And then those lumpy white parts are quartz. I already showed you that. So while this was happening, there was also some stuff happening when the tectonic mountains formed. This was a bit after the immediate collision, but as the collision was happening, there was also erosion that was happening to these mountains. So the erosion happened when the collision was ongoing, and then it also continued when the collision was slowing down or finished. And these sediments that were eroded from the tectonic mountains were eroded westward to in rivers. And something that we can see proof of this is the Shawangunks. And the Shawangunks are also another one of my favorite places in the Hudson Valley. And this on the left is at Minnewaska, at Lake Minnewaska. And it's this beautiful white sandstone conglomerate rock that's incredibly resistant to erosion. And that's why the Shawangunks are a ridge, and that's why they show up the way they do, because a lot of the rocks surrounding it that used to be above and around the Shawangunks were eroded because they were softer. But this is made out of mostly quartz, and quartz is a very resistant mineral. So that's a big part of why they show up the way that they do. And this middle picture I love. I just took this recently on a visit to the ice caves at Sam's Point. And you can see some of the layers in the sandstone of when those rivers were depositing the sediments. And the types of rivers that these were not like the Hudson River. They were coming off these mountains. They were coming off these really steep slopes of those really tall mountains. And I didn't mention this, but the mountains were possibly as tall as the Himalayas. And the reason we know that is because of the sheer volume of sediments that have been deposited to the west, and told geologists that there was a lot of sediment and it must have come from somewhere. So it's really cool sitting on these rocks and looking at them on these cliffs, knowing that they were once these rivers, and they were originally made up of other minerals like clays and stuff, but since they existed for a really long time, pretty much everything else that was in those riverbeds got eroded away and broken down. And since quartz is so resistant physically and chemically, it stayed behind, and that's what got compacted into the rocks that we see here. So our next destination is, you guessed it, another orogeny. I tricked you before. I made you think that there's going to be another breakup after this, but not yet. It's coming. So 430 to about 345 million years ago, we have the Akkadian orogeny, and this is yet another microcontinent that collided with Laurentia. So I used to get so confused when I was learning about this in college. We would have quizzes and tests about this whole sequence of events in the Northeast. And I actually had a whole class about the geology of New York State. And so I learned this. I really repeated this enough to have it down to memory, but it can be really confusing because there's a lot happening in this car crash. So this was another collision, another set of mountains that formed. And these were the Akkadian Mountains. And this is the reason we have the Catskills. So the Catskills, you may have heard, aren't real mountains geologically, but they formed as a result of this orogeny, because as those mountains were eroding, they sent more sediment westward, and this formed the Catskill Delta. There was still that inland ocean, so it wasn't just going into, dry land like we see today. It was still, a shallow ocean, an epicontinental sea is also called. And so when those were eroded, it eroded as that sea was getting shallower and shallower and eventually going away completely. And that's why the Catskills have a coarsening upward sequence. So at the bottom of the Catskills, if you've ever hiked one of the mountains there, you'll notice that the rocks are more fine-grained rocks like shale, or siltstone. And then towards the tops, towards the peaks, are sandstones and conglomerates. And that's because that sea was slowly receding away. And as water bodies get shallower, their sediments get coarser. So think of like a beach. When you go to a beach and you step in the sand, sand is a very coarse grained material. You'll probably find some pebbles and cobbles. Maybe a nearby river is, dumping some pebbles into the beach area. But as you go further out, your feet kind of touch the more muddy parts that are kind of more gross for your feet to feel. I guess it depends who you are, but some people like that. Some people get freaked out by it. If you think about that, it's pretty easy to remember this, that shallower means coarser sediments and deeper means muddy, murky, really fine-grained sediments, because the water can't carry those heavier things far out into the ocean. Here's another photo I showed earlier, but I also just wanted to show it because this is the Austin Glen Formation again, and this was taken across the river in Kingston. And the reason I'm showing this is because these layers of rocks were once horizontal, or mostly horizontal when they were being deposited on that ocean floor, on the Iapetus ocean floor. And from this car crash of our area's history of all these collisions happening, even if these rocks weren't directly affected by being metamorphosed by the later collisions, they still were affected because those collisions put a lot of stress on the rocks that were already there on the main continent. So when this Akkadian orogeny happened, it kind of like smushed a little bit of the rocks that were already here, and they weren't smushed enough to be I don't know how many times I've used the word smushed, but they weren't squished enough to be turned into a metamorphic rock, but they were completely just rotated. And I love when I see sedimentary rock layers that are essentially just vertical, because something crazy must have happened for them to be like that. Our next destination in our very long journey is the formation of Pangaea. So once again, not a breakup yet, but we're getting close. So earlier I told you about Rodinia, the supercontinent Rodinia. Now we're getting to the supercontinent Pangaea, which most people have probably heard about, but there have actually been several supercontinents in our planet's past. So this was the Alleghanian orogeny, and this is what formed the most of like what we know of as the Appalachian Mountains. So if you ever go to like North Carolina or West Virginia, those are mostly a result of the Alleghanian orogeny. And this map I like because when I'm showing people what Pangaea looked like, or what we believe it probably looked like, it's fun to show it in terms of, current continents that we can compare where they are now to what they looked like during Pangaea's existence. And with this, the Iapetus Ocean officially closed for good and ceased to exist. So that's a little sad because I love the Iapetus Ocean. But with this breakup of Pangaea, the Atlantic Ocean forms, and this is the Atlantic Ocean that we know of today, that exists today. And Pangaea broke up 200 million years ago, and as the continents spread apart over millions and millions of years to their current positions, the Atlantic Ocean formed in between it and the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. And here's a nice little like phase by phase diagram of what that breakup likely looked like. And yeah, it happened over a really long time. It didn't just, 200 million years ago, boom, broken up, but it was a slow process. So it was Pangaea, and then Pangaea broke into Gondwana land and Laurasia, which were two also supercontinents, and then eventually into the continents we know of now. So when that breakup happened, I like to use the metaphor of sourdough bread. And if you know me, if you've been to any of my walks or just have had a conversation with me, I love using food to explain geology. And so essentially what happened here is, imagine taking sourdough bread and putting it in the oven. And as it expands in the oven and it starts forming that hard crust, you see those little ridges and valleys starting to form as it stretches. So it's kind of happening as the crust is brittle and it can't really like stretch anymore. So it forms these little cracks in the crust. And it's really fun to look at that and kind of compare it to the crust and of our planet. So we had some things happen like in the Newark Basin and the Palisades. So not too much of like most of the Hudson Valley shows evidence of the Pangaea breakup, but you can go right over to Connecticut, and the Connecticut River Valley is a failed rift valley of when Pangaea split up. And then if you go down to the Palisades Parkway, I used to drive on this when I worked in the city, and I stopped one day and just was, so just overwhelmed with how crazy it is that I was standing on evidence of the breakup of Pangaea. So these are sills, which are essentially the kind of injections of magma during this split up. So as the crust was thinning, there was magma that was beneath the surface that as the crust was thinning, it was able to now reach, near the surface. So this didn't happen like a volcano, like a lava flow. It was slightly beneath the surface. It was still underground, but not enough underground for it to turn into like granite or something. This is called diabase, and it's the same exact composition essentially of basalt, of like lava rock if you were to go to a volcano right now. It's just slightly more coarse grained because it's still cooled underground, but it's not super coarse grained like granite is. And here's just another cool image I found of the breakup of Pangaea as it was happening. And you see this little where Atlantic Ocean is written, and you see the line that represents the mid-ocean ridge, which is where that rift began. So that rift, that the ridge right there, that is where Pangaea started its breakup. And that's really cool because now it's just so far away from us. And now we're taking a huge, huge jump from millions and millions and millions of years ago to just 1.2 million years ago to 10,000 years ago during the last ice age. So the last ice age began 1.2 million years ago during the Pleistocene, and it ended roughly 10,000 years ago. This is a really cool art piece that I love because it just really puts into your imagination what the landscape must have looked like at the time, and it's just incredible to think about. So the Laurentide ice sheet is what covered pretty much all of New York and a large part of North America. And this was during the Wisconsin glaciation, which is the most recent glaciation from about 100,000 years ago to 10,000 years ago. So there were multiple ice sheets that covered the part of the continent or most of the continent, but this most recent one is what we currently see evidence of, because as they, form over the landscape and then leave, we can only see evidence of the most recent ice sheet, and we don't really have evidence of the previous ones. Here's another cool comparison of how tall the ice was at its maximum. So at its maximum, it was thousands of feet thick. And here's just some cool little comparisons of buildings. So the Ice Age is a huge part of our Hudson Valley's history, of all of New York and frankly the entire Northeast. We would not have modern day Hudson Valley if it weren't for the Ice Age. Who knows what it would have looked like. This stuff that I've been telling you about this whole time is obviously extremely important because it's the foundation of the Hudson Valley in New York. But the Ice Age really sculpted the modern day landscape. So here's an example. Here's a little diagram of like everything that the glaciers do as it's receding. So as the ice existed over the land, it did this little dance where it was advancing in the colder periods and then receding when it gets warmer, and doing that many times until it made its last melting stage at the end and finally went away. And here are some examples of really cool things that we could see in the Hudson Valley because of the Ice Age. So this is a glacial erratic at Sam's Point that I'm standing next to. And as you can tell, it was really windy that day, but I love this picture because you can see like the scale of me standing next to it and how big it was. And here's a diagram showing how a glacial erratic is deposited. So as the glacier is moving forward in a colder period, it is grinding down on the landscape and kind of acting as this sandpaper mechanism on the rocks and the sediment, and just completely stripping away whatever soil was there before. And along the way, it picks up that sediment and the rocks, and also breaks a lot of the rocks. And sometimes it can break huge pieces of rock and carry it with the ice as it continues to advance. And then when the ice retreats eventually, the boulder kind of gets dropped as the ice melts and gets deposited somewhere new that it doesn't belong geologically. So sometimes glacial erratics can be, you know, a completely different rock than the bedrock that it's sitting on. In this case, it was still part of the Shawangunk formation, but it's a different part of the formation. It's just a really large rock formation, which is why it's the same. Here's another really cool thing. I love these. These are called potholes. And I don't love potholes in the road, but I love geologic potholes because they're another really common piece of evidence left behind of the Ice Age. And what happens is a rock or a group of rocks, like pebbles, they can be pretty small. And a lot of the time you can see them still at the bottom of this hole. They'll get caught up in this really intense current of the water, and it happens with meltwater. So the reason we have so many in the Hudson Valley is because of all the meltwater when the glaciers melted at the end of the last ice age. And in these stream beds, these bedrock stream beds, one of those cobbles would get kind of stuck in the bedrock and then get swirled and kind of drill a hole into the rock. And here is a not very great picture, but this is in Beacon at, I forget the name of the stream, but if someone knows, you can comment it. But I thought it was so cool because this is just one example, and it's actually a pretty small one. There's also some at Bash Bish. And speaking of Bash Bish, oh my gosh, I didn't realize how much I used Bash Bish in my presentation, but it's just a great example for so many things. Like during the Ice Age, the end of the Ice Age is what formed the waterfall, and from all that meltwater and the carving of the gorge. And here on the left is a diagram of how a plunge pool forms from meltwater that's really intense, and there's a lot of it. So it, you know, carves into the bedrock this deeper pool, and then goes on into the rest of the stream or the river. And this right here was in the spring of this past spring, and it obviously was a pretty strong flow that day, but it was much, much, much stronger at the end of the Ice Age when it was formed. And another really cool feature of the Ice Age is the marks on the rocks themselves. So on the left, we have chatter marks, which happen when, as I was saying, the whole sandstone, or sorry, the sandpaper mechanism, when there were pebbles or cobbles that got stuck in the rock, they would kind of be dragged a little bit and kind of like in little increments and I don't know, make these, I'm not explaining it really well, but they make these crescent shaped marks in the rock. And they also coincide a lot of the time, most of the time, with striations. And this, so the top left photo is from the Shwangunks as well. And then the bottom right is, I think that's at Opus 40 in Saugerties, which is a very different rock type, but you can see these parallel lines. Those are striations from when those rocks at the bottom of the glacier were grinding against the bedrock and scraping these lines into it. So lastly, I'm running out of time here a little bit. I'm talking a lot, but lastly, we have, before I go into the buildings of the Hudson Valley, we have the retreat of the Laurentide ice sheet, the last retreat. And during this, it formed proglacial lakes from all that meltwater. So one of those lakes was Glacial Lake Albany, which turned into the Hudson River eventually. So all these lakes obviously don't exist now in the way that they do on these diagrams. And that's because they were flooded eventually out into the Atlantic Ocean. And that's what formed the Hudson River. So before the Hudson River was here, it was a huge lake, and it left behind a lot of clay deposits, which is what I'm going to get into in a second. And then here's just some more beautiful pictures of the Hudson River and the Hudson Valley, because I just love looking at these and imagining how different it must have felt when it was being formed and when these huge floods were happening, when when those lakes were flooding out into the Atlantic. So congratulations, we have survived our time travel journey back over 1 billion years. And thank you so much for sticking with me for that journey. I know it can be really intimidating to learn about such complex topics, and also just know that these were also pretty simplified because there's only so much I can cover when talking about 1 billion years of history. But yeah, I'm going to quickly just tell you some fun things about the buildings of our Hudson Valley. So Rosendale cement is one example. It's called natural cement because this type of rock, it's called dolomite. It's kind of like limestone. It's essentially the same as limestone. And it was used as a natural cement in a lot of historic structures. So the Statue of Liberty, Grand Central, the Brooklyn Bridge, the foundation of the Brooklyn Bridge, and a lot more. And it was used a lot around the Hudson Valley as well. A lot of places that you can see the local dolostone or limestone is in just uptown Kingston. This isn't even the actual like cement that went through the whole cement making process, because that process involved a lot of like grinding down the rock and mixing it together and mixing it with other things. These buildings though are from the local carbonate rock formations. So it's really cool because when you walk around historic Kingston, this is Rough Draft Bar and Books, and the building across from it, which is part of the historic Four Corners intersection. And then there's also tons of stone walls all over the Hudson Valley and all of New England. And there's a lot to get into with this as well, but essentially these are really interesting because they are a part of our glacial history, because when these glaciers were receding, they dropped a lot of those sediments and rocks and dropped it into till, glacial till. And that's why if you have maybe a farm or you garden in the Hudson Valley, maybe you sometimes find like huge chunks of rocks or like big cobbles and pebbles randomly, or maybe you have like a bunch of clay and then like a layer of something else. So glaciers dropped stuff in different ways, and there's different kinds of sediments, but a lot of it was cobbles and bigger rocks. So farmers would, to get them out of the way when they wanted to farm, they would just collect them into these piles pretty much of rocks that they built into these fences. So they acted as fences, but the main reason for building them wasn't really to make the fence, it was to get rid of all the rocks out of the farmland. And this is a couple photos of a building at Innisfree. And I love this because you can see the roof tiles are from, I believe, the local phyllite, which I showed earlier in that photo of Innisfree, of that rock formation. And phyllite is very flat. You've probably seen slate roof tiles, and it works perfectly for roof tiles because it's stone and it's resistant, and it breaks on those nice little planes that make it easy to have all these nice tiles. And bricks. I actually just made a YouTube video about the bricks of the Hudson Valley. So because I don't have too much time and I want to get to your guys' questions if you have any, I will just do like a quick little spiel. The glacial Lake Albany that I was talking about before that left behind the clay deposits is what we used. I don't know why I'm saying we because I wasn't alive, but we as in humans use these clay deposits in the 1800s and 1900s for the Hudson Valley brick industry, which was a booming industry and sent a lot of bricks down to New York City to build New York City when it really had a lot of needs for the population growing and new building codes that were fireproof materials. So a lot of New York City's older brick buildings are made from the bottom of glacial Lake Albany. And here's another photo of Opus 40 in Saugerties. I just love this, even though it's not technically the Hudson Valley, it's the Catskills, but I just couldn't not include this because it's such an awesome place and a piece of art built from an old quarry of bluestone. Bluestone was formed from rivers in the Catskills that were depositing all that sediment into the Catskill Delta and then compacted into this nice blue, once again broken into these nice rectangular flat chunks. And that's all. Thank you so much, everyone. And I think we're gonna go into some questions now.
Thank you, Becky. That was amazing. I feel like I have time traveled over 1 billion years and learned a lot in the process.
I wish I could have seen everyone's faces while I was doing that, because that usually helps me get a good idea of like knowing when to move on to the next topic. It's a little hard to gauge people's interest when I can't see your faces.
Well, I can't see anybody else's faces, but I can tell you that Brian and I were both chortling quite a bit up here.
It's true.
It feels so funny, like giggling to myself when I make a little joke. I feel like a loser.
No, don't feel like that. It's fine. So just so everyone knows, we're going to be sending a follow-up email that's going to have a link to the recording of this webinar. Becky's going to send us a list of some resources if you're interested in digging into a little bit more about the local geology. So keep your eyes open for that follow-up email that'll come from us. Keep typing your questions into the Q&A box, and in a minute we will start getting to those. But first I wanted to remind you that next month our webinar is going to be on Wednesday, December 6th, and our speaker is Tom Wessels, who is the author of Reading the Forested Landscape. Now, this webinar is going to be a slightly different format from usual webinar style, where a presenter is just giving their presentation. Tom has actually asked that you submit photos of things in the forest that you find puzzling, and he will interpret them. So you submit your photos to us. I will put them together into a PowerPoint presentation, and we'll go through those with Tom. So when you register for that webinar, you'll be sent information on the email address to send photos to. And just think about what do you see out there that puzzles you? Do you see trees growing in rows, or rusty old wire fence that's embedded really deeply into a tree? Stone walls where the tree communities are different on each side of the wall. Anything that sort of piques your interest in the woods. So when you send in the photos, if you could also include in the email what your question is, because sometimes it's a little hard to tell what part of this complicated photo of the woods you want to ask a question about. So that is next month's webinar. So hopefully we'll look forward to seeing you on December 6th. We solve some mysteries together of the forest. And so from there, let's start jumping right into the Q&A. And the first question you already kind of answered a little bit. The stone walls that are dotted around the Hudson Valley, what are they made out of? Is that something you can go into a little more detail on that?
Yeah. I kind of breezed through that a little bit because I knew I was running out of time. But they're made out of pretty much what kind of rock is in your area. So in the Hudson Valley, we have all types of rocks, as you have learned in the past hour, but they can be anywhere from shale, sandstone, marble, conglomerate, limestone. It's essentially whatever the glaciers picked up and then dropped wherever you're seeing them. So yeah, pretty much whatever the available resources were is what they're made of. And another thing I love about that is it's so cool seeing the different types of rock walls that are built based on what rocks were used for it. So like if it's the shale or a sedimentary rock that has that rectangular flat shape, those rock walls are going to look a bit different and maybe a little bit neater than like the marble or like the chunks of quartz that are just kind of these like lumps of big rock that are kind of haphazardly piled onto each other until they stay.
Yeah, it's so true. There's so many stories in those walls. And
Yeah.
just a quick pitch for another future webinar speaker in March. Our speaker
I'm
is going to
very
be
excited for this one.
Robert Thorson, who wrote the book Stone by Stone, The Magnificent History of New England Stone Walls. So if you do have a particular interest in stone walls, make sure you tune in for that one as well.
I will be there for sure.
That's cool. Yeah, we all wonder about those stone walls we see everywhere. And I always thought the better piled ones were just for people who had more time on their hands, but now I know it's because
Maybe that too, honestly.
Awesome. So we have a question. I understand in southeastern Dutchess there are many marble outcroppings. Can you speak to how those formed, please?
Yes. So I realized I didn't really go too much into that, but the marble is definitely really interesting because that's another example of a metamorphic rock. And there's actually kind of this corridor of marble that is part of southeastern Dutchess and goes up into Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Vermont. And this was part of that shallow ocean I was telling you about after the tectonic orogeny. I know we went through a lot of mountain building events, but the first or the second orogeny I was talking about, the tectonic orogeny, when that carbonate shelf was there and deposited all those like seashells and bones and carbonate muds, that stuff eventually got buried and compacted into limestone, but then it got further compacted into the metamorphic rock marble. So that's really interesting because you can see the unmetamorphosed limestones, and then you can go further east to that corridor to see where more pressure and heat was put on the rocks and turned into marble.
Okay, and our next question is also to do with white rocks. What is the pure white rock I'm finding in our stream bed?
So that's something I would have to know your location for. But it's likely quartz for the most part, unless you're in southeastern Dutchess or eastern. Like I'm in Millerton and there's marble here, but quartz is going to be really commonly found in stream beds around all of the Hudson Valley because quartz in general is just an extremely common mineral, and it's in all the rocks for the most part in the Hudson Valley. And especially if you live in like Rhinebeck area, Red Hook, possibly Germantown or part of Kingston, there's the Austin Glen Formation that covers a large part of that area. And there's a lot of quartz veins in that rock formation that, since quartz is extremely resistant, when the rock breaks down, when the shale breaks down, the quartz veins are more resistant and they kind of stay more cohesive and then eventually get deposited into streams and riverbeds.
And stopping my young children every 2 feet when we go hiking because they're all the neatest rocks they've ever seen.
Yeah, quartz is pretty. There's a lot of different ways it can show up.
Yeah. This next question, I think you'll be able to field pretty well. How is it determined that the rock on Stissing Mountain is the most ancient of rocks?
So we as in geologists, not me personally, but geologists have done a lot of work over the years to get really good at identifying what rocks they're looking at. So in the Hudson Valley, we have a pretty good idea of the types of rocks we're going to see. And when I was telling you all about the Precambrian basement from the Grenville orogeny, the very first mountain building event I talked about, if we see like this crazy highly metamorphosed rock sticking up in this mountain in the middle of Dutchess County, we're going to be a little confused because we're surrounded by a lot of younger rocks like some marble and limestone and dolostone that are from like 500 million years ago or slightly younger. And when we see this gneiss, which is a really highly metamorphosed rock, that looks really familiar to rocks that we see in the Hudson Highlands that we know are part of the basement rock from the Grenville orogeny, and as well as the Adirondacks. When we see things that look really similar to that maybe I should stop saying but maybe scientists have done some like dating on those rocks to find out that they're really old. Like we can do a lot of tests on rocks to figure out their exact age, but also it's a lot of relative dating to see like comparing different rock formations and saying, oh, this rock looks a lot like that one rock over here that I know is 1.2 billion years old. Yeah, I hope that helps answer that one.
And now the next question is about rock hunting. Where are some good places for rock hunting to find interesting rocks, minerals, and geodes? And this might also be a good opportunity to talk about kind of the ethics of rock hounding.
Yeah. So in the Hudson Valley, you're not going to find geodes. I'm so sorry. Geodes are really cool, but we just don't have the type of rocks to form those. But you can go to old quarries or parks where they like allow rock collecting. Some, you can look up certain rock hounding spots in your area to see where you can go, like where it's designated to be able to like rock collect. But like Julie said, we always want to try to practice the principles of leave no trace. And if you do collect a rock, like I'm a geologist, I love collecting rocks. You don't have to take like a whole pile of them. If you see a cool rock you like and it's not gonna completely like disrupt a whole like if you're picking up a rock and it's completely like taking out roots of a native plant, maybe don't do that. And also you don't want to speed up erosion by taking away rocks that could possibly be helping stabilize the soil. So a lot of it is also just like looking up the principles of leave no trace and practicing that. Like I know even myself over the past 2 years, I've definitely gotten a lot better and more responsible when it comes to outdoor recreation and figuring out how to be a better steward. As in terms of where to go, I have to say I'm not too knowledgeable about like specific places in the Hudson Valley to go specifically rock hounding because I think all rocks are cool. That sounds so nerdy, but I personally don't like seek out places to go to specifically collect rocks just because like I think every rock I see is interesting. But I know that there are some mineral clubs in the Hudson Valley. I think Orange County has a pretty good one. And you can just look up, mineral or rock hounding clubs near me, and those people will have a lot more information. And also, there's like books that you can look at where a lot of the time the authors will have done some research to figure out like where you can actually go that's not going to get you arrested for trespassing.
I'm glad you professed the leave no trace ethic, but I'm surprised it took you so long to get to the point of all rocks are awesome. I thought that was going to be the first thing that came out of your mouth. All right. The next question is one that I think that I've asked you before, Becky. The little device you use to look at rocks and take photos, what is that called, and can you recommend one?
Yes, that is called a hand lens. It can also be referred to as a loupe. A lot of botanists and other scientists have these as well. I have gotten mine on Amazon. The one I have right now was a gift from my mom, so I'm not sure exactly where she got it from, but there are so many. If you just look up hand lens, and I think the general one for geology is 10 times magnification. I can look that up, more of the specifics, and maybe find a good example of one to recommend, and I'll include that in the follow-up email.
It is a very highly refined skill. I gotta say, I've seen Becky do this and I've tried it myself. It's really, really hard to get a decent picture holding
I've
a
had a
lens
lot
up
of
against your
practice.
cell phone camera.
Yeah, if you want to take pictures, I also recommend getting one of those lens attachments that I've seen people have. I guess I just like making things difficult and using my hand lens.
What's life without a little challenge, right? Okay, so now we're going back 2 million years. This question is, in the relative recent past, about 2.2 million years, most of the continental shelf was exposed during the glaciation periods. How much research and information exists on the geology in those shelf areas that are presently underwater?
That's such a great question. I know that there has been like expeditions on boats where people have done cores of the ocean sediments, and one of those actually wasn't on the rocks themselves, but one of those expeditions was actually how we know so much about the floods that formed the Hudson River and why we know so much about like the volume of the lakes that used to exist after the Ice Age, because they did cores of the different fans, the different like sediment fans that were formed from those floods. And there were multiple of them that they found and were able to map out and take samples of and take sediment cores of to study and figure out like what those fans are made of and how much stuff is in it to then figure out how big these floods were and how big these lakes were. So that's an example of sediment, but I don't know too much about like examples of research that have been done on the rest of the continental shelf. I definitely want to look more into that because that's a really great question. But I think a lot of it is like what's the word? Inference, like kind of just geologists kind of using educated guesses to figure out what makes most sense of like what rock formations and where.
Cool. Yeah, that's a pretty technical question, and I think I have an easy one for you next, so you can take a deep breath. So Mount Washington in Bish Bash Park is part of what mountain range? That reads like a
that sounds like a
Jeopardy question.
That's the tectonics. So that's part of the tectonic mountain range, and that it's interesting talking about the tectonics and the Berkshires because those are all essentially like different groups of current mountain, like different names of different regions of the current mountain ranges, but all of them were part of the ancestral tectonic mountains. So right now they are the stubs, the eroded stubs of those mountains. And what we see now actually used to be thousands of feet underground.
Now, here's a question from a little further north. So not in the Hudson Valley, but the Champlain Valley, where this person is very familiar with, has a lot of fossils like trilobites. And they're wondering, was that from the inland sea that you mentioned?
I'm guessing that would make sense because yeah, the inland sea was there for a really long time and trilobites have existed for a very long time. They don't exist anymore, sadly, but they existed on our planet for an extensive period of time. So trilobites are awesome. And I recently found my first full trilobite fossil this summer. So very jealous that you see them often if you do.
Yeah, that is very cool. And another one about coming from, other than about, can you recommend a few places to see potholes other than Bash Bish? I thought it was a question about Bash Bish. I don't want to get you too excited.
Yeah, Bash Fish is like my go-to to talk about anything geology related in the Hudson Valley. Yeah, so the picture I showed of potholes is in Beacon. I think it was on the trail at Madam Brett Park. They weren't as big though as the ones at Bash Fish, but they're still really cool because sometimes you can walk on the stream bed when it's not as when the bedrock is showing, when it's not as high water. I know that there's a lot of places further up north. I just didn't mention it because that's not technically the Hudson Valley. But I know that if you go to the Adirondacks or like anywhere that's close to Canada, that is where a lot of those floods happened. If you look more into the glacial lakes I was talking about, a lot of those floods happened or like started way up north near Canada. And so you'll find a lot of huge ones up there. And I'm sorry, I don't have any specific ones coming to mind right now, but can you note that down for me so I can also add that to the list and I'll try to find some examples. But honestly, a tip is like anywhere that you know has been glaciated in the past, and anywhere that has like a bedrock stream bed, that is going to be a good place to start.
I think you got a lot of people interested in going outside and looking at some rocks. The next question is asking, are there any cool geologic places to explore right in Millerton?
Ooh, I have another Millerton person here. So I really like Bash Fish. I'm just kidding. Honestly, though, Bash Fish is really close to Millerton. But we are right near the Tectonic Mountains. So anywhere in Connecticut is really cool geologically because we have the mountains right there to the east. And then there's also the Columbia Land Conservancy that has several places you can go to, like Over Mountain. What's it called? Over Mountain Conservation.
Yeah, the Over Mountain Preserve.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That is really cool because you can take a short walk up that hill, and I'm not sure if that's a drumlin, but that's a good question for myself. But you can see the Catskills on one side, and then you can look and see the tectonics on the other, and you're standing essentially on the tectonics. So it's really cool because you're standing on and looking at in all directions, like several different parts of our area's history. That's more of like a landscape thing. It's not really like looking directly at rocks themselves, but
aren't there some rock cuts along the rail trail in Millerton?
Yeah. I don't know why my mind is like blanking right now, but yes, the rail trail has some really amazing outcrops of the Stockbridge marble, which is really cool. And Allendale Mountain is really cool. That's one of the hikes you can do. I'm trying to think. You can go to Stissing Mountain is actually only like 15 minutes from Millerton. That's really cool. Yeah, that's all I can think of at the top of my head right now, but I feel like I'm gonna like log off here and think of like a million more.
I don't know, Becky. That's a pretty good swath of destinations you've listed. I think you can pat yourself on the back. I've been to some or most of those places and can agree that they're all wonderful. And
Cool. I'm glad I have the confirmation.
we're very lucky to be near these wonderful places. Next question, we've touched on this, but I just wanted to make sure there was no caveat or like asterisk when you said this. Someone asked, what is the etiquette around collecting rocks or fossils in natural areas? And your interpretation of this, and I think mine, is kind of leave no trace, right?
Yeah, I think that for the most part, like unless you are doing it for like a specific research project, try to leave most things there. It's really fun. I get really excited when I see things, and especially if it's something that's like really interesting, like you probably will want someone else to see that. So that's a big reason why I a lot of the time will leave things that I see, but also I just have not much room for more rocks in the house. But yeah, a lot of it comes down to the situation where you're at. Like if you're at a certain natural area that is taken care of by a certain conservation conservancy, couldn't find the word for that, or like another organization, you can go on their website or you can email someone and kind of like just ask their specific rules or what they want from you, just to make sure that you're respecting their all the effort and energy, the resources that they put into taking care of the land.
Yeah, always a good thing to emphasize.
Yeah.
So a sort of a probably somewhat related question. Could you speak about Herkimer diamonds a little bit?
Yes. I have a video on my YouTube channel all about Herkimer diamonds. I didn't mention it because it's not the Hudson Valley, but I've wanted to because they're so cool. And that was, those are Cambrian rocks. So those were part of that, the Iapetus Ocean that I was talking about. The carbonate shelf of that ocean is where these rocks formed. And then over time, so first they were limestone, and then over time they got dolomitized, which is essentially a process of where groundwater that's rich in magnesium somehow gets into the rock molecularly and changes the kind of like recipe of the rock to being more magnesium rich. And then over a really, really long time, the holes in the rock were filled in with the beautiful quartz of the Herkimer diamonds, which are called Herkimer diamonds because they have these beautiful crystal habits where they're double pointed. And that's not very common with quartz. And this is one of the only places in the world where you can find that specific type of crystal habit in quartz.
Cool. I need to watch your Herkimer diamond video. That didn't know a great deal of that. And I applaud your ability to still use very big words after an hour and a half of talking.
Honestly, my brain kind of feels like mush right now, but I'm doing my best.
Well, you're doing wonderfully because it is 7:32 and we have one very important question left, and then I think we're going to have to let you go.
Sounds good.
What is the geological explanation for New York City water from the reservoirs producing the best bagels?
Oh my gosh, that is so cool. And I wish I knew the answer to that. I've never thought of that before. I need to make a video about that because today I was actually thinking about the geology of potato chips from Long Island because my dad recently gave me a bag of potato chips that he got when he went to Long Island recently. And I was like, why do they grow so many potatoes there? Like, is it because of the glacial tilt? But yeah, I don't know. I think since most of the water comes from in New York City, most of the water comes from reservoirs upstate. I wonder if part of that is from like the minerals of the rocks up here. Like maybe it's more, I'm trying to think of the bedrock in the Catskills. It's more acidic, but also I don't know like how much filtering goes into the New York City water system to the point where it's using bagels. So I need to look into that more because that's such a cool question.
I knew that one would spike your interest with your food analogies and your
Yeah.
geological explanations.
Thank you to whoever asked that question and whoever asked any questions.
Yeah. So we want to thank Becky very, very much for her time tonight presenting to us, and what a wonderful job she's done. And we'll have this video up on our YouTube channel shortly for you to watch and rewatch all this great information. And we want to sincerely thank everyone for attending here tonight. And be sure to check out our Eventbrite page to see upcoming webinars. And yeah, just thank you very much, Becky. And
Thank you. Always love chatting with you guys.
yeah, it's always
Thank
wonderful.
you, Becky. I can't wait to see your bagel video.
It's added to the list.
Can do.
Thank you so much, everyone.
All right. Good night.
Good
Have a
night.
great night.